But what I want to make very clear is that Ukrainians are not going to surrender. Ukrainian never surrendered. And even though, yes, it is complicated, it is worrying, and we are all scared, but we're not going to surrender to Russia.
The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is rapidly accelerating. Hundreds of thousands of Russian troops have amassed along the Ukrainian border, and two regions in the east of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, have been declared independent republics, which has been recognized by Moscow. Joining me to discuss the unfolding conflict in Ukraine is Maria Chaplia. She's a Ukrainian national living in the UK. She is the founder of Ukrainian Students for Liberty, and she is currently a master's student at King's College London. Maria Chaplia, welcome to the Center for Risk Analysis. Could you provide our audience with an overview of the current context as well as the background to this conflict?
So to start with, Russia started a war against Ukraine in 2014. It started off with the occupation of Crimea, and then by the occupation of parts of the eastern regions of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk regions. But there is obviously a lot of historical context to it. So the roots of the current conflicts, they run much deeper, as President Putin in his recent speech has tried to acknowledge that Ukraine isn't a sovereign country, that Ukraine and Russia are one nation, and that some of his most outrageous statements included saying that Ukraine was created by Russia. So Putin has been doing for years actually to create this narrative of the unity between Russia and Ukraine. And in Putin's mind, Ukraine and Russia should be one country. And this is one of the main roots of the problem. In his mind, they should have never been separated, which is why he's been acting, Putin and Russia itself has been acting very aggressively towards Ukraine. But I think although the history of Russia and Ukraine is very long, I think the key main takeaways is Ukraine has never invaded Russia. Ukraine has never wanted to take over Russia. Russia has always been the aggressor towards Ukraine. Russia has been killing Ukrainians, banning our language, persecuting people, sending them to prisons and gulags. Russia has starved millions of Ukrainians to death. And at the moment, Russia is trying to do the same. And the full-scale invasion seems possible. Obviously, we can't predict what's going to happen. But it looks like in Putin's mind, this idea of unity between Russia and Ukraine is very, very strong. And this is one of the main reasons why Russia is doing what it's doing towards Ukraine.
Okay, so there's a lot of history between the two countries. But I'd like to unpack Vladimir Putin's motivations a bit more carefully. I've seen some polling from the Washington Post, which suggested that perhaps the appetite for invasion amongst ordinary Russians is not as strong as many people are portraying. There is a narrative that Vladimir Putin is doing this to shore up domestic support. So if ordinary Russians don't really like the idea of invading foreign countries, then why is he doing it? What do you think are his primary motivations?
So I think there is a number of things to consider here. As I mentioned in Putin's speech a few days ago, he was trying to again acknowledge that, and he was speaking to Russian. It was in a speech aimed at the Russian audience, where he was trying to tell them that, look, we are being threatened by the West, we're being threatened by NATO, we are being undermined. He was trying to make Russians feel as if they are victims and they are being attacked. And so he has to step in and save Russia, save Ukraine, especially Ukraine from some neo-nationalists. We don't have neo-nationalists in Ukraine. We are a democratic country. Putin has been creating this narrative for years. And although I do agree that with years passing by, domestic audience is buying this less and less. And the sanctions, they're going to hurt Russian people as well. They're not just going to target oligarchs. All of Russia is going to suffer from sanctions. But I think what many people fail to understand when they talk about Putin's motivations, and this was very evident from his speech, is that Putin doesn't really care that much about this cost and benefits analysis, which we so often hear about, as in, if we make the cost of invading Ukraine very high, Putin's probably going to back off. Or another idea would be that domestic audience doesn't want war, and so Putin's not going to invade. Well, this idea of accountability works in democratic countries. It doesn't work in authoritarian countries, and Russia is obviously not a democratic country by any means. From his speech on Monday, what we learned is that he's a psychopath, he's obsessed with history, and Putin probably sees himself as this historical figure who has to reunite all of the Russian world in his mind, which also includes the Baltics, by the way, under his rule. And he's going to do anything that he can do to make that happen. He's building his legacy on this.
Okay, so we saw a motion from the Duma, the Russian parliament, initiating or supporting this idea of invading these regions. And there were also these very public consultations with the Security Council. Are you suggesting that these are not necessarily part of a due process, that it's basically window dressing for Putin and his actions, to provide cover for his actions?
Yes, I think to an extent. So the Security Council meeting, which you mentioned, it was very peculiar because the members of the council and the participants, they all kept repeating the same thing. Their argument was, yes, we should recognize those republics as independent entities. So it was very much like a staged circus, because they, one by one, they just kept saying the same thing. No opposition to Putin. There was one official who was trying to, who messed up his wording a bit, and Putin was very not to say aggressive, but he didn't like it very much because something was not going according to the script. So I think they're trying to create the impression as if Putin is not the one deciding everything, especially the fact that the Security Council meeting was live and Putin's speeches are live, so the world can see them. They're trying to look like, I don't know, some kind of democracy. They're trying to show some transparency in their decision making, but there is none. What transparency or democratic processes can we talk about if no one disagrees with Putin, at least not that we know of in his government?
Right, and it seems to me, sitting here in South Africa, that Vladimir Putin is essentially engaged in a power game. And one of the key points that he raises often is Ukraine's desire to join NATO and also ultimately the EU. Do you think that it is a wise decision for NATO to be expanding its membership eastwards and potentially antagonizing Russia? Would it not potentially diffuse the situation to take that off the table, to say Ukraine won't become a part of NATO, even if strategically Ukraine might want that in order to have that military backing of the alliance? Do you think that that could be a way out of this conflict?
I think the main problem with such a perception is that, well, NATO is it has a sovereign right to accept nations or to deny them membership. Ukraine, as a sovereign country, has right to apply for the NATO membership or don't do this. And if we deny this right of Ukraine to decide or to apply for NATO membership and NATO's right to accept or deny countries entry, then what idea of sovereignty are we going to talk about? It just, I understand geopolitics of it, and that some would argue we don't want to provoke Putin. We are trying to preserve this world order where post-Soviet countries, which is actually at the moment not the best way to refer to Ukraine, the Baltics, and other countries that were once part of the USSR, that this post-USSR world, to say so, has to be in the Russian area of influence. Well, those countries, which is fascinating and which is exciting for the West and for them, they keep choosing West. We see Poland right after the fall of the USSR. Poland joined NATO. We see the Baltics who joined NATO and the EU as well. We see Ukraine aspiring to become the member of the European Union and NATO. And so I think Russia is just losing this war values, losing this war of ideologies, and authoritarianism, which is represented by Russia in this case, is losing against democracy in the West and in the US. Obviously, we can argue between ourselves how democratic the US and the EU are, but they are still way, way better, and their values are more humane than those of Russia. And so I think Ukrainian people have made it very clear in a countless number of polls that the majority of them want to be part of NATO, want to be part of the European Union. In 2014, many Ukrainians died on the idea of the EU membership. And so I think it's not negotiable for Ukraine as a country and for other politicians to have a say, we don't want to be part of NATO. Too many people died for that, and the nation wants it.
Right, Maria, well, you're speaking to us from the UK, but you obviously have family and friends still in Ukraine. What is happening on the ground there? What is the sentiment like? I'd imagine that anxiety levels are very high.
Yes, the anxiety levels have been peaking in the past few days. I'd say especially after Biden's announcement that Putin has made a decision to invade Ukraine, after Putin's speech on Monday. Everyone seems very anxious, and for a reason. Just yesterday, Ukraine's president signed a law introducing a forced conscription for people who are in reserve, which implies that all males in Ukraine between 18 and 60 who are in reserve will be conscripted, which raises obviously many worries and questions among Ukrainian families. What do you do? What's your choice? And generally, it's a great number of questions which one has to answer and to be concerned of. But what I want to make very clear is that Ukrainians are not going to surrender. Ukrainian never surrendered. And even though, yes, it is complicated, it is worrying, and we are all scared, but we're not going to surrender to Russia.
Maria Chaplia, thank you very much for joining us on the CRA. Let's hand over to you, our audience. What do you think of Vladimir Putin's motives for invading Ukraine? Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. Also, a quick reminder that the CRA will be hosting a post-budget briefing at 1 o'clock today. There are links in the description below where you can sign up for this webinar if you are a client. If you're not a client, you can join us on our 30-day free trial. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.